green equals Frankenstein. Welcome to the Alyosha Society, everybody, where we are pursuing truth, beauty, and goodness through great literature. This is video number 4 out of 10 total on Frankenstein. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, you should be looking at something like this. Here's our outline of videos. We finished up the opening letters. We're going to review that frame within a frame story framework. Get it? In a minute. And today it looks like we're doing volume 1, chapters 1 through 5. So screenshot this, write it down, do what you got to do. This is the schedule. So be sure that you are looking at finish volume 1, chapter 6 and 7, and then go ahead and read the first 2 chapters of volume 2 before you get into chapter 5. I'll bet you one thing, probably be wearing my green shirt. Yeah, it's Frankenstein. It just fits, guys. Yeah, it really does. Okay, frame within a frame. Here's our frame within a frame, story within a story. So do you remember what the outer frame is? That would be the letter writing that's taking place between Robert Walton and his sister, Mrs. Saville, also known as Margaret. Does Margaret ever return his correspondence? Well, yes, she does, but we don't have any record of it. Okay, Mary Shelley wrote the whole story as giving the reader, you and I, access to Robert's letters only. So that's the outer frame. Now, the inner frame, Robert tells a story about how he's on this adventure and he wants to explore the North Pole and so forth. I showed you a map. They're traveling from Petersburg to Archangel. They're in the Russian frozen tundra. And he meets Victor Frankenstein. They get him up on the boat, just like the ancient epics. They clean him up, give him a meal, and Victor then tells his story. That's what we're going to get into in this lesson. That's the inner frame. That's the inner frame. In the previous lesson, we talked about how the outer frame provides us with themes that are preparing us for the inner frame: love, friendship, life, death, interest in science. That's the recap. Let's get to it. Chapter 1. So remember the story arc. Remember the plot trajectory, the 5 parts of the plot: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, finally the resolution at the end. Everything's kind of tied up. Well, do you see here the beginning of chapter 1, chapter 2? We definitely have Mary Shelley in full-blown exposition mode. Victor tells his story. He tells us about his birth. Line 1, I am by birth a Genovese, just referring to the town of Geneva in Switzerland. He talks all about his parents, his growing up life. He talks about the fact that this girl, Elizabeth, who was their cousin, his cousin, they brought her into the house, sort of adopted her, and he grew up with her. This is just standard exposition. Very well done, very interesting, very believable. Remember, we talked about the suspension of disbelief. Mary Shelley is drawing us into the story. Page 25, from this time, Elizabeth Lavenza became my playfellow, and as we grew older, my friend. Now, store that away. His relationship with Elizabeth is going to be very important later, really going to develop. It's going to be a huge part of the story a little bit later on. Page 26. Now, I think Mary Shelley is doing something really fascinating on page 26. Here she's or Victor, I should say. Victor is describing what he's like and what Elizabeth's like. It seems to me that what Mary Shelley's doing here is giving us a little bit of Enlightenment versus Romanticism. Remember, Enlightenment, focus on reason and intellect. Romanticism, focus on nature, intuition, the heart, feelings, emotion, more of a 19th century movement. And Mary Shelley's living right in the middle of the two, and she feels the tension. Look at how she describes on page 26, how Victor's describing himself and Elizabeth. Everyone adored Elizabeth. If the servants had any request to make, it was always through her intercession. We were strangers to any species of disunion and dispute, for although there was a great dissimilitude in our characters, in other words, they were very different, there was a harmony in that very dissimilitude. I was more calm and philosophical, there's your Enlightenment worldview, than my companion, yet my temper was not so yielding. My application was of longer endurance, but it was not so severe whilst it endured. I delighted in investigating the facts relative to the actual world, that's science. She busied herself in following the aerial creations of the poets. The world was to me a secret which I desired to discover. To her, it was a vacancy which she sought to people with imaginations of her own. That, I tell you, that one paragraph, Mary Shelley gives us the essential, characteristics and differences between 18th century Enlightenment, 19th century Romanticism. More on that to come. I think what Mary Shelley's doing here is just kind of dropping some seeds that are going to grow. And that is why I spent time in those introductory videos, making sure that you understood what those two movements were and so forth. Okay, page 29. So I'm kind of nearing the end of chapter 1. This is, he's talking about when he was still his childhood and so forth. And there was a thunderstorm, lightning strikes this tree. There's a fire. Important event. Bottom of the page, the catastrophe of this tree excited my extreme astonishment, and I eagerly inquired of my father of the nature and origin of thunder and lightning. He replied, electricity, describing at the same time the various effects of that power. Now remember, guys, we use electricity every day, all day. We take it for granted. We don't think about it. This was around the time when electricity was discovered. It was a new, exciting thing. They didn't really know completely the power of electricity. And there were some folks who thought, maybe it can reanimate the inanimate. Yeah, that's just a fancy way of saying maybe it could bring back the dead. Maybe we could use electricity. So there were scientists doing experiments on animals, frogs and such, dead ones, seeing if they could bring them back to life. That's important because you know where this is headed, right? You know where this is headed. Okay, chapter 2, page 31. More exposition. We don't really have a major crisis yet. Okay, Mary Shelley's really dragging out the first part of the plot structure, Elizabeth and Victor growing up. He talks about Henry Clerval, his best friend, and he continues to talk about how he was captivated by, yes, lightning. Then, page 32, he talks a lot here about the death of his mother. And she died calmly. Her countenance expressed affection even in death. I need not describe the feelings of those whose dearest ties are rent by that most irreparable evil, the void that presents itself to the soul, the despair that is exhibited on the countenance. This is a really important paragraph, guys. This is, Victor is describing, even at a young age, relatively young age, his connection, his relationship, his experiences with death and the impact that death has on the living, of course. And once again, do you see all this kind of coming together? He's fascinated with science. He's fascinated with electricity, with lightning, and he is very, very heavily impacted by death. Yeah. I think you see where this is headed. Let me see, page 38. I'm just kind of hitting the highlights here for you. This is in chapter 3. Victor is still telling his story. He's a grown man now. He's talking about how, remember, he's telling this story to Robert Walton, who is writing the story to his sister, Margaret. Remember, we have the frame within a frame. He talks about how his mother had died of scarlet fever, and his mother had wanted him and Elizabeth to marry. I need to mention something here, because this is very common. Definitely in the early 19th century, we would look at it today as weird and appalling that cousins would have a romantic relationship and in some cases even get married. That was not a huge deal. You'll see it in the Jane Austen novels. And yeah, so I'm just preparing you. That's not a weird or unusual thing. You know, it happens, for example, in Mansfield Park. The heroine and the hero, the two main characters there, Fanny Price and Edmund Bertram, they're cousins. Yeah. So anyway, so Victor had been interested in what we call alchemy. I don't know if you've ever heard the term alchemy, an alchemist. An alchemist is someone who believes that you can take a metal, maybe something like this very large coffee mug I'm using, and turn it somehow or another into gold. I mean, it would be a pretty cool thing if you could do that. He gets to the university and his professors start disparaging his alchemy and all the thinkers that he had been following. They're like, that's not real science. So Victor is now learning, at least from the perspective of his professors, what real science should look like. Page 39, a little over halfway down. One of the phenomena which have peculiarly attracted my attention was the structure of the human frame, and indeed any animal endued with life. So he's also interested now in the human body. Whence I often ask myself, did the principle of life proceed? It was a bold question, and one which has never been considered as a mystery, yet with how many things are we upon the brink of becoming acquainted if cowardice or carelessness did not restrain our inquiries? What is the secret of life? What is it that animates us? Now look, as Christians who believe the Bible, we believe that God breathed life. It's a miracle. You're not going to understand it somehow or another into the first man, into Adam. And then he created Eve out of Adam's rib. So we believe that God is the answer to the question of what's the secret of life? Where did it come? How are we alive? But that's the question that Victor is wrestling with. You see how this is all going to come together. Once again, it's like putting all the pieces in the blender. So the fact that he decides one day that he's going to build a new species of human being out of, you know, body parts of corpses shouldn't really shock us all that much. He's definitely headed in that direction. Look at the bottom of page 40. And after days and nights of incredible labor and fatigue, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life. He believed that he had discovered the secret of animation, of life. Nay, more, I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. Oh boy, here we go. This is where the fun begins. Page 42. So he decides that he's going to take body parts from corpses. He's going to build a new species of, I don't know, I guess it's kind of human, but we're going to call it the creature or the monster. Top of page 42. I resolved, contrary to my first intention, to make the being of gigantic stature, that is to say, about 8 feet in height, proportionably large. Ooh. I mean, if you're going to build a human or if you're going to make a monster, you might as well make him in such a way that he could make billions in the NBA. I mean, 8 feet tall? Who's going to guard him? He may not be great at shooting three-pointers, though. But imagine the monster dunks. Pun intended. Still on page 42. I'm going to build, quote, a new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. I'm going to be the father. I'm going to be the creator. I'm going to be like God. That if I could bestow animation upon lifeless matter, I might, in process of time, although I now found it impossible, renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. Okay, you see, he's kind of turning into, the mad scientist, routine, which we kind of all know is the stereotype associated with Dr. Frankenstein. Chapter 4. I love this chapter, and I am going to read the first page of it in its entirety because I think it's pretty fascinating. Page 45, chapter 4. It was on a dreary night of November. Of course it was on a dreary night of November. It had to be. And there had to be some thunder and lightning. Anyway, that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I love this, that's my favorite line in the whole book, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard in a convulsive motion, agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful, great God! Yellow skin, scarcely covered, the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was lustrous black and flowing. What is this, like Fabio? Is he going to be like a French model? Not exactly. His teeth of pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this, I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I created, I rushed out of the room. He went from ecstasy and joy and elation to horror. Oh, yeah. Well, you know what, buddy? Not a good idea to run out of the room. What are you going to do? What are you just going to leave this thing like unattended? Where's the babysitter? I beheld the wretch, middle of page 46, the miserable monster whom I created. He held up the curtain of the bed, and his eyes, if eyes they may be called, were fixed on me. His jaws opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds with a grin wrinkled in his cheeks. Okay. He builds the monster, and now it's alive, and he's horrified. And the monster is gone. Pandora is out of the box. The monster runs away. Chapter 5, we are introduced to a new character, Justine. Remember, I mentioned her earlier in the story. She's going to be super important in the next lesson. So watch out for Justine. He had finished the monster, of course, but he runs away, and that's more of that in chapter 5. The monster is on the loose, and Victor himself gets ill. Victor himself becomes sick from what he's done. And in chapter 5, we have a letter from Elizabeth to Victor. We're going to learn what's in that letter and what happens as the monster escaped in the next lesson. But I want to introduce you to a concept here. Well, actually, I'll do it in the next lesson. But it's what I call the Russian doll concept. You know, it's the frame within a frame within a frame within a frame kind of thing. Well, it's sort of like, you know, the Russian dolls. You know, you take them out, you've got another little one on the inside of that. You take that guy off, you got another one on the inside of that. Take that guy off, you got another one on the, and it keeps going and going. And they're pretty cool to kind of play with. That's kind of what's going on here. Now we have a letter that Elizabeth wrote Victor. Victor is telling, I get mixed up myself. Victor is telling Robert Walton about this letter. So that's frame within a frame. And remember, Robert Walton, and Robert Walton is writing letter to his sister telling all of this. So frame within a frame within a frame. Yeah, it's kind of like the Russian dolls. Next lesson, be sure you get your reading done. All right, you're going to finish volume 1 and read the first 2 chapters of volume 2. It only gets better. Yeah.